Hello and welcome back to a brand new video of Fox Reacts. Today we're checking out another one from Gnoggin, apparently about Goodra. Let's hop in and see what he's talking about.
This video is sponsored by Squarespace.
We need a plan. Right now they're probably... gross! I just sat on something slimy!
Hey, is that the twerp?
It's a Gumi!
It is indeed. Gumi, Sliggoo, and Goodra are cool enough that they gave Ash one in the X and Y anime. And since then, Goodra has become quite the popular Pokémon. Especially among certain groups of fans. These mono-dragon type slime dragons are quite a bit more than meets the eye at first. Look at this. They pull not only from your silly European Puff the Magic Dragon style dragons, but also from the snails in medieval manuscripts, classic JRPG slimes, and even a yokai, especially Hisuian Sliggoo and Goodra. And come to think of it, just how are they different? Why did the Goodra in Old Sinnoh have shells and depression? Well, let's talk about that in today's episode of Gnoggin. Which is brought to you by Squarespace. If you need a website to promote your business, social...
Hold back. A slime.
Slimes tend to be the lowest of the low in your classic JRPGs. Often the very first sorts of enemies you fight, other than maybe rats. They are weak, pathetic, and amorphous. I mean, just because they're basic slimes. Sure, there are often stronger slimes in these games later on, but the basic ones, they are just that. Basic. And as a video game trope, we definitely have Dragon Quest to thank for that. The popularity of the cute little slime enemy led to it becoming the series' mascot, and these days it's one of the most recognizable characters in Japan.
Even without playing the game, you know of it.
And one of more than just the Dragon Quest series, but to JRPGs and even RPGs in general. Which, of course, is what eventually led to the creation of Pokemon in the first place. So really then, why did it take 6 generations for Pokemon to get a slime? In the classical sense, anyway. There is Muck and Grimer, but they are living sewage, goopy puddles,
not slime.
Gross.
Toxic waste.
They aren't the pudding gelatinous slimes with actually defined shapes like the Dragon Quest slimes, gelatinous cubes, and choo-choos, for instance. Maybe they just didn't want to step on Dragon Quest's toes, or maybe they did think that Muck was enough. Up until Gen 6, when they based their new region, Kalos, on France, famous for its love of snail eating and being the slimiest.
And yet these don't have shells.
Actually,
they're more like
RPG
slugs.
slimes predate video games. Arguably, H.P. Lovecraft's Shaggoth from At the Mountains of Madness is a slime that was written about all the way back in 1931. And there's the classic amoebal alien slime in The Blob from 1958, and plenty more. Gary Gygax, the creator of Dungeons & Dragons, was heavily influenced by the media of his childhood, and thus the slimes in 1974's Dungeons & Dragons were born. And they've been a staple monster ever since. Even the first edition of the game included a variety of slimes. Things like ochre jelly, black pudding, gray ooze, and yellow mold, just to name a few. And they too became an icon of sorts. A staple for turn-based tabletop role-playing games. So when the genre moved into video games, slimes came along with them. The Flan from Final Fantasy especially seemed to fit D&D's descriptions of them. And some of them have arms sticking out, which is kind of like Gumi having antenna-like horns. Heck, some of them do have antenna. So question now, why are there antenna on the slimes and on the Gumi line? Well, because of the real world's slimiest creatures, of course. Slugs and snails. What is a slug if not a real-world slime? They are sticky, leave behind trails of slime everywhere they go, are sort of amorphous, and many of them are poisonous. Plus, they dry out, just like Gumi. According to the Pokédex, its body is mostly water. If it dries out, it will die, so it's always sitting with perfect stillness in the shade. The poor things. That's actually the plot of the episode where Ash meets Gumi. They gotta get it wet. This is why you'll most often find slugs and snails under plants and pots and wood and things. It's moist and shaded to keep them from shriveling up and dying. It's also why the biggest land slugs and snails live in areas where the air is almost always moist, like the adorable banana slugs in the Pacific Northwest. But being able to die so easily to something as simple as, the air is 1% too dry, it's pretty pathetic, and they are so soft and
is
easily
a little...
squishable, and even most land snails have such weak armor that all it does is add a crunch sound effect to their pulverization. Nothing more. And their biggest weakness, other than being crushed, is just salt. Salt!
Well,
a
that's
rock
because
so
it
lame
dries
we
them out.
actually eat it. And we use it to make other food just taste better, yet it makes snails
It literally...
burst
never
their
mind.
insides out.
Whoa,
It's
wait, what?
ludicrously lamentable.
I thought
Thus, another of
made them
Gumi's
just go...
Pokedex entries stating that it is the weakest dragon-type Pokemon. Ouch. But that brings us to the next question. Why does a slug thing turn into a snail dragon? I mean, Slugoo is even more snail-shaped, and even has this little soft snail shell design.
I see it now.
It's like a semi-slug, which is just that, a slug, with a little bit of a transparent snail shell around it.
Oh.
And then it's a full-on dragon.
Gross. Oh,
What's up? Well, think back again to those RPGs, Dragon Quest, Dungeons and Dragons.
Of course.
The boss monsters that are their namesake are powerful.
I mean, it just
Dragons
makes
in
sense.
some
You
mythologies
start as
are
the weakest and
godly
become the
strong.
strongest.
So in these games, they are often late game or even the final bosses. Whereas slimes tend to be some of the first monsters
I'm not
you
sure
face.
that bottom image
Giant
is
slimes
allowed.
often being
Oh, there we
early
go.
game or even the first bosses. So, in a way, the Goodra line is referencing an entire RPG trope, but it goes deeper.
Yeah, I actually
as
get
using
it.
snails in place of dragons actually dates back a millennia. Everybody knows the classic story of a
Interesting.
valiant knight bravely staring death in the face by facing off against a large dragon. It's a tale that has been told and modified in every conceivable way. Millions of times, I'm sure.
Nice.
And even back in the days of chivalrous knights, it was seen as a common story trope in Western European folklore and
Of
fairy
course,
tales.
it was pretty much a story
So,
trope. It was everything.
Wouldn't it be funny to make them fight like the lowest of the low things instead? Ha!
Maybe.
Apparently, manuscript writing monks thought so. So, there are many manuscripts depicting knights fighting snails found all over the place too, all throughout Western Europe. It was almost like a meme for medieval monks. Though, nobody knows for certain why they drew all these, but
Now
there
that
are
is
a
a
few
joke.
theories. My favorite one, though, is that it is in fact just a joke. Even several centuries ago, humans were still people. But it does
Humans
set a
have always just
scale
been
of
assholes
creature
to each
tiers,
other,
doesn't
so of
it?
course we do
The
stuff like that.
almighty dragon at one end, and a meager slimy little snail on the other. So Gumi to Goodra. You could even call tyrant kings draconic in their reign, while the lowest of people are the slimy con men, sewer rummaging snails.
Interesting
and criminals.
drawings.
But speaking of Gumi, the fact that it has horns and this body shape makes it most similar to Wiwaxia, an extinct genus of soft-bodied marine animals that were covered in a very carbon-esque set of scales and horns.
I don't know what it is, but I like
During
it.
the early to mid-Cambrian, and were extremely tiny, only growing to be like 2 inches in length. And at first, they had these scales,
Cute.
almost like dragon scales, and as they matured, they would start getting all these spiky protrusions. But
Like
wouldn't
dragon
get all of them until
horns.
adulthood, so Gumi is like an in-between of a baby and adolescent Wiwaxia. But Gumi and Slugoo also seem to pull a bit from nudibranches, which are soft-bodied gastropod mollusks that live in the ocean and are extremely
those
brightly
sea
colored
slugs.
and absolutely gorgeous.
That could actually make a lot
Many
of
of the
sense.
nudibranches in the clade Alodida are so bright and colorful to ward off predators because they are poisonous and
So
or
beautiful
venomous,
and
and bright
poisonous.
colors are a well-known signal in the animal kingdom. One that means, stay away from me if you know what's good for you. They don't synthesize their own toxins, though. Instead, they get it by eating stinging-celled sea creatures like anemones or manowar. The toxins
kind of
then
just like
stored
the,
in their carota,
Poisonous
Serrato.
frogs.
one of those, which are the tendril-looking things on nudibranches. So, Gumi's Moondex entry saying its source of protection is its slimy, germ-laden mucous membrane could be a reference to the fact that nudibranches get their toxin from eating other stuff. Stuff with germs. It's toxic. They just don't want to say poison or toxic or venom in the dex
Okay.
because it's not poison type. They don't want to confuse
So Gumi
people,
likes
and
to
that
eat
just
poison
be
mons.
confusing. And if we want to go specifically into which nudibranch it could be most inspired by, I'd say a good contender is Glaucus atlanticus, otherwise known as the Blue Sea Dragon.
Ooh.
Or the Dragon
I remember
Slug.
that. It's so small yet
it's
so
not a slug,
poisonous. A single touch could kill an
Well,
adult.
it probably wasn't used as an inspiration for Gumi's design, but it could well be why Gumi is dragon type and ends up evolving into a dragon. It's an aeolid nudibranch, and one of the toxic ones too, so it all just fits. But notably, the word nudibranch comes from the Latin nudus, meaning naked, and the ancient Greek Bapraxia. Bapraxia.
You don't have to keep
Bronxia,
trying.
which means gills. But why are they notable for their nakedness? Most animals are naked. It's because they actually start out with a shell as babies, but then they lose that shell in adulthood, which is interesting because Gumi starts out shellless, and then it gains a shell when it evolves,
and then
only
loses
to then
that
lose
shell.
it again. But if it's in Hisui, then it gains a huge shell.
That actually
and
hides
keeps
him.
it. I guess it's to sort of just flip the script on you. Also, poor Hisui and Goodra look sad and depressed. I wonder if Gumi's name being so close to the word gloomy was an inspiration to
I think
make
it's
Hisui
more
and
just
Sliggoo and Goodra
tired
so sad and
than
lonely.
sad.
Because they are. They don't just look it. Hisui and Sliggoo is described as a creature given to melancholy, and Hisui and Goodra loathes solitude and is extremely clingy. It will fume and run riot if those dearest to it ever leave its side, which on one hand is sad, and on the other,
is
sort of adorable, like a dog with separation anxiety.
Oh.
And this is also probably a play on goo being so sticky, like a dog with separation anxiety. It's like it's
again about the
emotionally
separation
bound
anxiety.
to.
Come on.
But what about Hisui caused them to be sad? Well, maybe it's because back in these Hisuian days, people
Humans
were
always
scared
ran.
of Pokemon.
Yeah,
All
okay.
Goodra wanted was to befriend people. Or perhaps it's so lonely because it's sheltered. It's lonely and hidden away because it's a homebody.
Oh, come on, Noxon.
Do you get? In Japan, they refer to eastern dragons, especially the serpentine, arm and legless ones, in a few ways, including their own word, tatsu, or the Chinese long, because it's so narrow and long. That was a joke. Sometimes they will even use the Sanskrit word naga, but when referring to the Western-style dragon, with the 2 or 4 legs and wings and all that, they usually use doragon, which is the Japanese way of pronouncing dragon. And if we look at Goodra's Japanese name, Numergon, we can see that Gon affix, which very well could be a reference to how its upright stance and having 4 limbs makes it clearly more Western dragon inspired.
Kind of like
and
a
also
drake,
that it
then.
originally comes from a non-Japan inspired region, Kelos, France. Also, speaking of Goodra's name, if we look at the French name for it, we see that it's Muplodocus, which is a combo of Aegis and Diplodocus, which is a dinosaur. Now, you would think that it's named after a theropod, the 2-legged, pretty upright ones, because, like, Goodra is sort of a theropod. It's 2-legged and pretty upright. But no, it's named after a 16-ton, very much 4-legged sauropod. Not something you'd think they'd give a dinosaur that's well known for standing upright. I don't know if that has anything to do with anything beyond a weird localization thing. I just thought it was interesting enough to bring up. Just like their eyes.
Oh god.
Like, at first I thought Gumi's eyes were the green, like Sliggoo and Goodra's, and that the black dots were its nostrils. But no, the black dots are its eyes, and the green is just decoration, like gross Pikachu cheeks. And actually, according to the Pokédex, Sliggoo's eyes dissolved, so it can't see anything. Which might have something to do with them being just green voids now. Thankfully, they grow back as a Goodra, and that's perhaps a reference to Slug's insane regrowth abilities. One group of Japanese scientists not too long ago learned that some sea slugs can get fully decapitated and just regrow their whole body, no problem.
Look at that.
Curiously now, though, none of these Pokemon have eyes on the ends of long stalks, like real snails and slugs, which is probably just to make sure they don't look dumb.
But yeah, look at that.
But I do like that they still included these snail stalks just as antennae or horns. And actually, according to the Pokédex,
Could still
Goodra's
use them for like
horns
some
are
kind of
retractable,
sensing.
the same way that real snails' eye stalks are retractable. It's a really fun design aspect of them. As is taking a French mythical creature into consideration. This is Lucarcole, a giant, viscous, slimy snail serpent with a big upright shell on its back. Honestly, it's just a more hardcore Sligoo, for real.
Yes, it
but
is.
now,
Look at that.
Hisuian Sligoo? Why is its shell so much bigger now? And why is it sideways? And in Japan now? Well, because Hisuian Sligoo, and to some extent Hisuian Goodra, is probably heavily inspired by a yokai, the Shusebora, meaning ascended or promoted trumpet shell, which is a turban or trumpet-shelled snail that lives 1,000 years in the mountains, 1,000 on the plains, and 1,000 at sea. And having now lived 3,000 years, it will ascend and turn into a dragon. It's called an ascended trumpet snail because of the Japanese concept of shuseo, which is an idea that some fish are called different things at different stages in their life. Kind of like how bugs are known as pupa or larva or what have you, depending on the stage they are in. But with shuseo, since fish don't really have that obvious metamorphosis beyond egg to fry to adult, how can that be? Well, it's more like they're called different things based on their size, and sometimes on what region of Japan they were fished from. One example is the amberjack. Depending on its size and the region, the fish has a number of different names. When it is under 15 centimeters, it is called wakashi. When it is over 15 centimeters, but under 40 centimeters, it is an inada. Around 60 centimeters, it becomes a warasa, and around 90 centimeters, it becomes a buri. Shuseo is also applied to other fish such as koi, tuna, and the sea bass, which in one stage of Shuseo is known as bora, which is probably where a part of the name Shusebora comes from. Especially when we consider that bora could also come from hora, short for horagi, which means giant triton, which is the snail that the Shusebora starts life out as. And remember, a lot of yokai start life as a normal animal or a normal everyday object, and then they get turned into a yokai as they get really old and or become possessed with supernatural energy. That makes sense. Now though, let's get into the actual yokai itself. Long ago, the ancient Japanese believed that giant triton snails were born high up in the mountains. And remember, Hisui,
could it be like the other way
Hokkaido, they're very mountainous regions. These snails live there, doing snail things for 1,000 or sometimes 3,000, depending on the source, years, and then turn into a yokai that goes and lives near the villages of the people. Then, after another 1,000 or so years, they burrow underground, and then burrow their way out to sea, where they live their life as a dragon in a shell. And of course, they get bigger as they're living those initial 1,000 years in the mountains. That way, they'll be proper dragon size by the time they reach the ocean. And as mentioned, Bora can also be Hora, and Hora is also a name for the kinds of caves left in mountains after mudslides. The people who explored those mountains looked at these caves and thought, a giant creature must have lived here, but where did it go? And then extrapolate from there. There are even stories in newspapers about this as recent as the Meiji period, aka the time period that Legends Arceus is most inspired by. But this leads us to the elephant question in the elephant room. Why snails in mountains?
We got an ad. We're back.
Well, since Japan used to be underneath the ocean in the ancient past, and earthquakes and mudslides are a common thing in Japan, you can find fossils and shells of snails all over the place in the mountains. So, most likely, people collected enough of these shells all the way up there that they just assumed that snails definitely lived up there, in the caves. The same exact caves that they thought some sort of big yokai came from. And the reason why they're named after the triton or trumpet snail is undoubtedly because most species of triton snail are huge.
Very big.
Gargantuan. They're not that big, but they're very big for snails. Coronia tritonus is the biggest of them, and it can have a shell up to 20 inches. So again, not far-fetched to believe that the ancient Japanese saw an empty shell of one and thought it was big enough to be deserving of being the home of a dragon of some sort. Most often, Shusebora is typically depicted as a dragon popping up out of a shell that is facing upwards as opposed to the hole facing down forward like most snails, which is probably why Hisuian Sligoo is popping up out of a sideways-looking shell instead of the normal snail shell. Notably, there is also a Digimon based on this too, and even it has the
Really?
shell sideways.
Shellmon?
It's a regular old snail shell again. Notably, the Pokédex says it's able to freely control the hardness of its metallic shell. And it is steel type. This new shell and ability may be inspired by the scaly-foot gastropod then, a sea snail that has a lot of iron in its shell, the amount of which varies with time based on its recent diet, almost as if it were controlling its hardness in an oversimplified way. Plus those huge scales and the fact that it grows its own iron suit of armor and thrives in white-hot hydrothermal vents sounds pretty draconic to me. As for the very defined upright shell, that probably has to do with the Sapporo Maimai snail, a snail native to Hokkaido that has an incredibly well-defined snail shell.
Look at that
Look
shell.
at how
It's kind of
perfectly
beautiful.
swirly that is. The swirl just pops right out at you. And interestingly, while most of the time their shells are upright, the way you typically imagine a snail, they do sometimes be on the side, hence Hisui and Slagoo going from sideways to upright with a very defined swirl, and also hence their signature move, Shelter, where they just go into their shells for a defensive buff, just like the Sapporo Maimai snail. And
well, it's all cute,
all snails, really. So all in all, the Goodra line has every reason to be both in Hisui and Kalos. Snails and dragons and the mythology involved pulls from both real-world locations.
Snails, dragons,
OG
slimes,
Goodra
and
is more of a slug slime, while Hisui and Goodra is more snail. Possibly also being a reference to slugs being found all across Europe, hence the European Goodra being so sluggy, whereas most slugs in Hokkaido are invasive species, though there are plenty of snails, hence Hisui and Goodra being more of a snail.
And
actually, some parts of Hokkaido have so many snails that the Ainu language radio station, FM Nibutani Broadcast, is nicknamed FM Pipausi, which means a place where there are many marsh snails. Snails are very important to the Ainu, who are those native to Hokkaido. Sorry to end with just another fun fact like that. It's just how I roll sometimes. Never stop using your noggin. Woo.
That's perfectly fine.
Dang it, the TV, how long has it been on?
Well, that is the end of today's video, so I want you all to remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Down in the description will be a link to the original video, so remember to support the original creator and all they do. And I'll see all of you folks next time. Peace out.